Hello everyone and welcome to today's video. Today is my part 2 of my 2028 presidential bracket video series where we had the first matchup of the top 16 Republicans and Democrats potentially running for president of the United States in 2028. We did that, we picked one winner of the matchup. Now we're on to the Elite 8 where we have more matchups of the candidates trying to advance to the next round, and we are going to start now in this video today. Without further ado, I'm going to get into it. I'm going to show you what the matchups are, and then I'm going to also give a brief just breakdown of what I did in the first round. Starting with the Republicans at the top of the list, we have J.D. Vance, the Republican Vice President of the United States, taking on Senator Ted Cruz of Texas. Vance was able to beat Missouri Senator Josh Hawley in that matchup in the first round, and Ted Cruz I had beating Nikki Haley in a contested matchup in the first round as well. In my first video, if you watched it or did not watch it, I explained that I view this as a 1v1 Republican primary and Democratic primary. So I think once all the delegates and stuff are factored in, who do I think of these two people would get more delegates? And I had Vance getting more than Hawley and Cruz getting more than Haley. As for the next round, we have J.D. Vance versus Ted Cruz. I think a lot of this heavily depends on how the Trump administration would be viewed in the 2027-2028 election time. I think Vance and Cruz, I think both are very conservative and very, I would say, allies of the MAGA wing of the Republican Party. So policy differences, there may not be too many, but I do think a very big contingent here is how the Trump administration is viewed. And I think right now in the Republican Party, it's pretty clear cut that J.D. Vance, I think, is the most likely person to be the Republican nominee. And I think versus Ted Cruz, he would win this matchup and advance onto the next round, and that would have Vance defeating Cruz. It would be a very interesting matchup, but I do think Vance would go ahead and win. Now we scroll down to the next matchup where we have now Secretary of State Marco Rubio, former Florida Senator, facing off against Sarah Huckabee Sanders. This one is a very, very fascinating matchup because you have two people in the Republican Party who both have at times been viewed as rising stars in the Republican Party, and back in 2024 there were rumblings that both of them could have been in consideration to be President Donald Trump's running mate once upon a time. So this could be a very interesting matchup. Marco Rubio was able to beat Tom Cotton, in the first round of that matchup. I had Rubio advancing. Sarah Huckabee Sanders was able to beat Tim Scott, and she was able to advance on that one. This is very, very interesting and a very close matchup. Rubio versus Huckabee Sanders. It would be a really fascinating situation because these are two people who are both very loyal to the president. They've both worked in the president's administration. And I think this one would truly, truly come down to the wire. And what's interesting is for 2028, I'm not sure either one of them is going to run for president, but I do think both of them would be a very strong consideration for being vice president of the United States. The question is, though, which one of them would win. In CNN's ranking, they have Sarah Huckabee Sanders at number 4, Marco Rubio at number 5. Both of them are very, very close in terms of ranking, but the question would be which one of them would be able to beat each other in a Republican, or beat the other in a Republican primary. And in this one, it's tough because Sarah Huckabee Sanders was the former press secretary. Now she's governor of Arkansas. Rubio was senator of Florida. Now he's President Trump's Secretary of State. I think it's more likely that Marco Rubio has a little bit more name recognition at this point in the Republican Party as he's going to be the Secretary of State. So I think Rubio versus Sanders nearly ends up with Marco Rubio barely defeating Sarah Huckabee Sanders and advancing to the next round. But this honestly may be one of the closest matchups if this were to happen between Rubio and Sarah Huckabee Sanders. But that's a very, very close matchup, one of many to come. Next on, we have number 3, Brian Kemp, going up against the president's son, Donald Trump Jr. This one, I made a very bold claim in the first video where I had Ron DeSantis, the Florida governor, running against Donald Trump Jr., and I actually had Donald Trump Jr. pulling the upset in defeating Ron DeSantis. My main reasoning for this was we essentially saw what this kind of looked like in 2024, where it was Donald Trump versus Ron DeSantis, and Ron DeSantis, I believe, dropped out either right after Iowa or right before Iowa. And I don't think in a DeSantis versus Trump Jr. matchup, obviously the president will throw all of his support behind his son. And I think there may be a similar situation where the Republican Party becomes, do you support the MAGA wing of the party and the Trump wing of the party, or do you support Ron DeSantis? And in this matchup, I don't think it would be as lopsided for Trump versus DeSantis. I think there would be more people for DeSantis in this matchup, but I do still think a large enough wing of the MAGA party, or the MAGA Republican Party, would support Donald Trump Jr. over Ron DeSantis, which made him advance. Georgia Governor Brian Kemp went up against Elise Stefanik, the now United Nations ambassador and former representative from New York, and I had Brian Kemp winning that matchup, touting his success in Georgia as the Republican governor, being elected in 2018 and 2022. Now we have Brian Kemp versus Donald Trump Jr. What's interesting about this one is it's very similar to DeSantis versus Trump Jr., though Brian Kemp, I think, has been able to show he's worked with President Trump and had his spats with President Trump, and yet he's always seemed to come out of it not unscathed, but more unscathed than DeSantis had. Kemp never ran against Trump at the presidential level in 2024, and I do think in a Kemp versus Donald Trump Jr. matchup, I think this one would come a little bit more down to earth, where I think Kemp would be able to advance and defeat Donald Trump Jr. in this primary, though I could certainly see and make the argument for Donald Trump Jr. defeating Brian Kemp in this one. I think Brian Kemp being the governor of Georgia and DeSantis being the governor of Florida would weigh on Trump Jr. being the president's son and not having really any experience in elected office, but I do think Kemp would be able to narrowly pull off an upset here. But I will say the DeSantis versus Brian Kemp matchup would have been very, very fascinating if that did end up happening. But I do think DeSantis running for president in 2024 kind of hurt his chances a little bit in 2028, as if he'd waited to 2028, he may not have had a lot of the disdain from the more MAGA wing of the Republican Party for running against the president. So Brian Kemp advances, and now we have the last matchup on the Republican side of Texas Governor Greg Abbott versus Virginia Governor Glenn Youngkin. This one is very, very fascinating because in the first round, Greg Abbott, the governor of Texas, was able to beat former South Dakota governor and Trump administration official Kristi Noem. And Glenn Youngkin, the governor of Virginia, was able to beat former North Dakota governor and Trump administration member Doug Burgum. Abbott versus Youngkin, we have the governor of the state of Virginia going up against the governor of the state of Texas. One is a very important Republican state that has been a Republican stronghold for a while now and is one of the largest states in the country in population and is one of the largest states in the country by area. Glenn Youngkin, however, is the Republican governor of Virginia, a state that used to be a Republican state in the 1900s and started becoming more of a toss-up state in the early 2000s, and has now become a likely Democratic state. And he's likely going to be out of office, I believe, at the end of 2025, going to 2026. He is term limited and cannot run again. So he'll be out of office after that. So we have Greg Abbott, we have Glenn Youngkin. Both of these men are mentioned a lot when it comes to running for president in 2028, and I would not be shocked if both of them do decide to run for office in 2028. The question will be here, how do both of them go on the national scale? Because outside of Virginia, Glenn Youngkin made a lot of news headlines for being elected a Republican governor in Virginia in 2021. How well will he be known nationwide, though, and how well will Greg Abbott be known nationwide? That's really the question. And I think this one would be very, very close. I do have Glenn Youngkin narrowly winning and advancing against Greg Abbott. Whenever there's March Madness, there's always an upset or two. But I think Donald Trump Jr. defeating Ron DeSantis would be viewed as an upset. I don't think Glenn Youngkin in a Republican primary would lose to Greg Abbott in a head-to-head matchup, because I do think Youngkin would be able to do well enough in a lot of the northern states and the southern states. Greg Abbott would obviously do very well in Texas and a lot of the Midwestern parts of the country, but I think Glenn Youngkin would be able to hold on and would be able to win that matchup. So now going on into the final matchups on the Republican side of things, we have Glenn Youngkin going up against Brian Kemp, the number 2 and number 3 seeds, and we have the other matchup of J.D. Vance going up against Marco Rubio. So these are the 4 remaining Republicans that are up for grabs. That's going to be the final 4 on the Republican side of things. On the Democratic side of things now, we have the remaining matchups. Kamala Harris versus Tim Walz in round 1. I had Kamala Harris defeating Tim Walz right now. She's still the leader in all the early primary polls. She's up against Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, facing off against Ruben Gallego in the first round and defeating her. This one is absolutely a fascinating matchup for the 2028 Democratic primary, because we just saw a few days ago, as of the time of recording this video, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was doing a rally with, I believe, Bernie Sanders, and they're both getting a lot of Democratic voters, trying to get them energized to resist President Trump and get energized for the 2028 election and 2026 midterms and starting that early. And Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Kamala Harris, obviously you have the former Vice President of the United States, just the 2024 Democratic nominee. She right now is leading in the polls, in a lot of polls, by 20, 25, 30 points. And AOC is someone who is seen in the Democratic Party as sort of a rising star and a young face in the party that could potentially, if the Democrats are looking for a young Democrat to rise up out of nowhere and win the nomination in 2028, could AOC be someone that potentially could do that? The question is, does Kamala Harris's early lead in the 2028 Democratic primary polls translate from now till 2028? She was just on the ballot in every single state, so people know who she is. Maybe they feel she didn't have enough time to campaign after Biden dropped out and suspended his candidacy. Maybe Democratic voters give her another chance. This is not uncommon, though, as these sentiments were also around for both Al Gore in 2000, John Kerry in 2004, and even at a time Hillary Clinton in 2016. So it's not uncommon for these sentiments to be a thing, and it almost always results in the person not being the nominee again. But we did just see President Trump become the Republican nominee again 4 years later after the 2020 election. So it has certainly happened in recent history. Though Trump was already the president, Harris was the vice president. So it's really a close matchup between Harris and AOC, and I actually think this is one that really would go down to the wire. But I do have Kamala Harris narrowly winning this matchup and advancing against AOC. I think we did see in 2016 and 2020 that Harris would probably more likely than not take a lot of the Joe Biden support of the Democratic Party, while AOC would represent a lot of the Bernie Sanders support of the party. And it's going to be interesting how 2028 plays out. But I do think for Harris and AOC, Harris would narrowly be able to win and advance to the next round. Next, we have Wes Moore, the governor of Maryland, facing off against Gavin Newsom, the governor of California. This is a big matchup among two heavyweights in the Democratic Party. Wes Moore, the governor of Maryland, as I mentioned, he was elected, I believe, back in 2022. Obviously, the situation with Baltimore, with the bridge and everything, he was thrusted into the national spotlight, and a lot of people started to know who he is from that one. I had him beating Andy Beshear in a very close matchup. I'm very bullish on Wes Moore's chances if he did run for president in 2028. I think he would give the Democrats a chance at having a young rising star come out of nowhere. But he also is going to be facing off against Gavin Newsom, I have him defeating Stephen A. Smith in the first round of the 2028 Democratic primary side of the bracket. Now we have Newsom going up against Wes Moore. Newsom, the biggest unkept secret, or the biggest known secret for a while now, is Newsom's going to run for president in 2028. He's been doing podcasts. He's been staying active in the Democratic Party. In addition to being governor of California, Gavin Newsom wants this Democratic primary. And Wes Moore versus Gavin Newsom, it's going to be a question probably of name recognition is what it comes down to. And I think Newsom does have higher name recognition than Wes Moore. I think if given both the same amount of media spotlight, I think Wes Moore could potentially take off and end up being very competitive in a Democratic primary, maybe being able to win it. But I do think right now Gavin Newsom versus Wes Moore, how it plays out in a head-to-head matchup, given their standing in the party, I do think Gavin Newsom is very narrowly favored to win that matchup against Wes Moore, but I certainly think that would be a very, very competitive one. Now we scroll down to the next matchup where we have Gretchen Whitmer, the governor of Michigan, going up against Pete Buttigieg. So we have a Michigan throwdown here as Buttigieg moved to Michigan, I believe after either during the Biden administration or just after it. And Gretchen Whitmer in the first round defeated Rahm Emanuel. Really not too much of a shock there. She was able to win that primary. And number 3, we have Pete Buttigieg going up against Cory Booker in the first round. Buttigieg won that. This is a very, very fascinating matchup because right now in all the early primary polls, usually it's Kamala Harris at 1, 20 points ahead, and Pete Buttigieg in 2. So right now, Buttigieg is polling in second place. Gretchen Whitmer, the governor of Michigan, she has won 2 elections now as governor of Michigan, obviously getting elected and reelected, and she's won by big numbers, likely Democratic margins, in both. So she's had impressive victories in a very important swing state that Donald Trump has won in 2016, almost won it in 2020, and won it in 2024. So Michigan's a very important state for the Democrats, and Gretchen Whitmer would certainly present a strong avenue for the Democrats on that front. The biggest problem for Whitmer, though, is we saw in 2020, Pete Buttigieg caught fire in the 2020 Democratic primary. He's a very good debater, very good speaker, and a very good campaigner, and someone that the National Democratic Party would probably love to have run for president in 2028 again. He's someone I think a lot of Democrats rallied behind in 2020 before ultimately choosing Joe Biden. And I think in a 2028 Democratic primary, I think it'll kind of be like where things left off. He passed on the 2026 Senate run in Michigan, I think for this reason, to run for president. And in Whitmer versus Buttigieg, you're going to have a lot of the same Democratic voters essentially being targeted in this Democratic primary. Both of them are going to try to challenge and go out and get everyday working Americans and Rust Belt Americans and Democrats who maybe do agree with some of what President Trump supports, but maybe wants to go away from President Trump for various reasons. I think both of them would go after a lot of those voters in the Rust Belt, and after a very hard-fought matchup, I do have Pete Buttigieg winning over Gretchen Whitmer, but I think this would be a very, very close matchup and one that would really go down to the wire. A contested convention honestly probably wouldn't even be ruled out in this one. It'd be so close. But I do think Buttigieg would end up winning this matchup versus Whitmer. In the last matchup on the Democratic side, we have the governor of Illinois, J.B. Pritzker, versus the governor of Pennsylvania, Josh Shapiro. This is a very interesting one because Pritzker, who defeated John Fetterman in the first round, I said a big reason for Pritzker being able to win was the amount of money and wealth that his family has, essentially be able to bankroll him at least in the early parts of a Democratic primary. Josh Shapiro was able to defeat former Biden administration official and governor of Rhode Island, Gina Raimondo. Now Josh Shapiro is facing off against J.B. Pritzker. And Josh Shapiro, by many, including myself, I thought he was the strongest choice to be Harris's VP choice in 2024. I thought he would have been able to energize a lot of voters in Pennsylvania to turn out and vote for him, and probably would have given her a much better chance at winning Pennsylvania, or Harris giving her a chance to win Pennsylvania against Donald Trump in 2024. I still think he remains a top 3 candidate right now in the 2028 Democratic primary. Pritzker, again, is going to have the money, he's going to have the name recognition, and he's been very vocal against the Trump administration. He'll have that going for him, but I think Josh Shapiro right now does start out as a very formidable Democrat in a Democratic primary due to his ability to win over a lot of independent voters, which he was able to do in 2022 in his Pennsylvania governor election. Now, obviously, he did go up against a pretty weak Republican opponent, so maybe in 2026 we'll see if Shapiro does the same, if he does worse, if he faces a stronger Republican opponent, how does he do? That may either help or hurt his 2028 chances, but for now, I think Shapiro versus Pritzker starts out as a Shapiro win in a 2028 Democratic primary. So Shapiro advances. This means on the Democratic side of things, I have Josh Shapiro will be facing off against Pete Buttigieg in the next round. That's going to be a very, very tight matchup. That's going to be very, very close. Now we have Gavin Newsom versus Kamala Harris. That's going to be a California throwdown in the final matchups leading into the Final Four on that one. Gavin Newsom, Kamala Harris, certainly going to be a very, very close one. On the Republican side, just a reminder, we have J.D. Vance versus Marco Rubio, and we have Brian Kemp versus Glenn Youngkin. So after that round, we now have 8 people remaining. We have Vance, Rubio, Kemp, Youngkin, 4 Republicans, Shapiro, Buttigieg, Newsom, Harris, 4 Democrats, leaving our Elite 8 left going into the final matchups where we're going to have Harris and Newsom facing off, and the winner going up against Buttigieg and Shapiro facing off, and then Vance and Rubio facing off, and the winner of them facing off against Kemp and Youngkin. Going to be a very, very interesting video to do. I can't wait to do that. As I mentioned in my last video, this is my own ranking. This is how I see things going right now, but I'm very interested to hear what you think. Obviously, bracket, there's a lot of possibilities, so I'm very interested to hear what you think, how it will go. Make sure to leave a comment below telling me who you think will win these matchups or who do you think will win the bracket. If you disagree with me on any of the picks I made, I'd love to hear why and why you think so in the comments. I really look forward to reading all those. Please remember to give the video a like and click subscribe. I also hope to see you again in a future video as I post a new video every single day.